Hi everyone, welcome to our latest session of the EVN Masterclasses. My name is Anahita. I'm one of the policy fellows at BASIC. To some of you who will have joined us before, you may know that these EVN Masterclasses are a really great opportunity for us to tap into the fantastic network of experts that we at BASIC are very lucky to have, who get to share their expertise with you, our Emerging Voices network. As you know, the masterclasses are aimed to be an accessible digital resource that are primarily available to you, our EVN members, but also to the general public. So as we've mentioned before, we have a landing page on our BASIC website where you can also find a list of our previous masterclasses in case you haven't seen some of those. And we'll also be sharing this slightly further down the line. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Sahil Shah for a session called Nuclear Diplomacy with Iran, Then and Now. Sahil Shah is a senior fellow and program manager at the Council on Strategic Risks, Jan E. Nolan Center for Strategic Weapons. Previously, he was a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network, where he served as a senior Iran policy advisor. While at the ELN, Sahil advised senior government officials and other stakeholders on strategic and nuclear risk reduction issues and convened international security dialogues. In particular, he led the organization's efforts to strengthen nuclear and regional diplomacy with Iran. Sahil is also senior policy advisor to the Institute for Security and Technology, IST, on its next generation Catalink hotline project. He also previously served twice as a policy and outreach consultant to the Office of the Executive Secretary at the CTBTO and was on the Swiss national delegation as an expert advisor during the last NPT review conference. He was previously named the Gorbachev-Schultz Voices Awardee and an Aspen Strategy Group Rising Leader, and also a delegate in both the P5 Young Professionals Network and non-governmental expert level dialogue. So, as some of you may know, Iran has been thrust back into global headlines in recent days and weeks due to unfolding regional security flashpoints. Over the last several years, Iran's nuclear program was a large focus of both transatlantic cooperation and confrontation, as the US and European allies worked closely with Russia and China to conclude the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, before the US ultimately violated the deal by reimposing secondary sanctions. Since the agreement was put on life support, the parties have failed to restore the deal's main bargain, despite intense diplomacy under the Biden administration. Now, there are concerns over the trajectory of this file. They're higher than ever before, given the additional complications that war and crisis in the region have provided. Sahil today is going to dive into exploring some of these key considerations with a bit of an overview of the changing dynamics in nuclear diplomacy with Iran and Iran's role in the nuclear field. And I'm really thrilled for this lesson. I think it's going to be a great one. So we'll kick off with Sahil's presentation, and then we'll have a portion for discussion. So please do feel free to share any thoughts, comments, or questions that you might have, because we'd like for it to be as interactive as possible. And with that, Sahil, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me, Anahita, and also for all of you for attending. And hello to anyone who's going to be watching the recording a bit later. Just as a disclaimer, today I'm going to be outlining my personal views and reflections, which don't necessarily represent the views of any of the organizations that I'm proud to be affiliated with. As background, from 2018 to 2022, I worked closely with European governments and other governments like Russia and China to see how we could manage the Trump administration's reimposition of secondary sanctions on Iran, which violated the terms of the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal. It's no secret that the UK, France, Germany, the EU, and many other US allies had launched a major campaign after President Trump was elected to try to keep the US in the deal. At that point in time, Iran was certified as being in full technical compliance with the terms of the deal, and there was no real reason for the US to exit. What was cited was that Iran was violating the spirit of the deal. What that means is yet to still be understood by analysts because it really has no meaning. But of course, after the US exited, the Europeans in particular really tried to step up to try to figure out how to do damage control by trying to make up for that economic loss that Iran was going to suffer from. And of course, we know that sanctions relief was what Iran was meant to benefit from doing its commitments under the deal. Of course, the Europeans were not able to do so. The power of the dollar over compliance by companies, over compliance by banks, just led to a really messy situation, which led us to a place after President Biden was elected, where it became very difficult to understand what to do. The US, Europeans, others tried for over a year to come up with a text that could work for everyone, a roadmap for each side to return to full implementation. But at the end of the day, it didn't work. The draft that was last agreed to was in August of 2022 on paper, but in practice, politics got in the way. After that, of course, doing a deal with Iran for the US and the Europeans became even more untenable due to domestic considerations like human rights issues, Iran's relationship with Russia, and its in particular Russia's actions in Ukraine and more. And now, if you fast forward, we are seeing that Iran, like Anahita said, is back in the headlines because of a flaring up of regional tensions, all whilst the nuclear file remains a big question mark. And in the coming days, the IAEA Director General is due to travel to Iran because in recent weeks, there has been a revived nuclear policy debate in Iran on how they should orient themselves. But before we get to discussing today, I want to start with a timeline of how we even got here. I think that oftentimes we get caught up in the now, and really there is a long history when it comes to Iran's nuclear program, and also how it's developed its nuclear policy and posture and doctrine. So back in the 1950s, the United States actually helped Iran create its nuclear program through the US Atoms for Peace program. President Eisenhower intended for this program to help developing countries like Iran use nuclear power for energy and other peaceful applications, medicine, agriculture, etc. In 1967, Iran's first nuclear reactor, the US supplied 5 megawatt Tehran research reactor, went critical. It operates on uranium enriched to about 93% at that time, and it was then converted to run on 20% in 1993, which the US also supplied. In 1970, the Majlis, or Iranian Nuclear Parliament, ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. And after that, the former Shah of Iran established the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, which still exists today, which was the body and still is the body that does basically all of the nuclear effort in Iran. And at that point in time, had announced plans to generate about 23,000 megawatts of energy over 20 years, including through the construction of, say, 20 plus nuclear power plants and the development of a full nuclear fuel cycle. Well, that all doesn't really entirely materialize because the monarchy falls apart. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the relationship between Iran and the United States changes dramatically. We all know about the 15-month Iranian hostage crisis. And I mention this because this hostage crisis and what came after it essentially created the formula for what has been American policy that every single US administration, whether Republican or Democrat, has used, which has been trying to balance pressure and persuasion, carrot and stick, coercion and diplomacy, and largely haphazardly failing at doing so. Even though at that point in time, Iran no longer received help with its nuclear program from the United States, nuclear development continued after being temporarily halted. In the 1980s, we saw US-Iran relations further deteriorate, and in 1984, the US added Iran to its list of state sponsors of terrorism, effectively imposing sweeping sanctions on Tehran. A few years later, Iran acquired the technical schematics for building a P1 centrifuge from the AQ Khan network. In the early 1990s, the US Congress passed the Iran-Iraq Arms Non-Proliferation Act in 1992, which prohibited the transfer of controlled goods or technology that might knowingly and materially try to contribute to Iran's proliferation of advanced conventional weapons. At the same time, a conversion of that Tehran research reactor was also completed. After that, we saw more pressure from the United States on different sectors of Iran's economy. And in late 2022 is when things really heated up. The National Council of Resistance on Iran, it's a political wing of an organization called MEK, who you still hear about today, held a press conference and declared that Iran had been building nuclear facilities near Natanz and Arak. One of the key figures in that discovery was Corey Hinderstein, who I'm sure many of you know or will meet along the way. She's a deputy administrator for defense nuclear non-proliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, at the Department of Energy. Corey was sitting in the audience as a young researcher, like many of you, and the MEK representative at the time used the word cascade, which in this world means centrifuges. And this is a crucial step between uranium found in nature, which is totally harmless, and the uranium that has been processed so that it can be used in a nuclear reactor or in a nuclear weapon. Most of the uranium found in nature cannot sustain a chain reaction. So to make a bomb or to make fuel for a nuclear power plant, you have to separate the tiny amount of fissile uranium that will. And the concentration of useful material, uranium-235, is less than 1% of uranium found in nature. So to make a bomb, often people say it needs to be enriched to about 90%. So that's where centrifuges come in. You put the uranium into a gas, you put it in a centrifuge, and you spin it. It's like the same principle as a washing machine or a salad spinner. Spinning separates the heavy bits from the light bits, but a centrifuge spins much, much faster than your washing machine. And basically the edge of the centrifuge is spinning at about the speed of sound. So each individual centrifuge only does a little bit of that work by itself. If you really wanted to build a bomb or have a bigger, energy capacity, you need to be building thousands of centrifuges, each connected by pipes. And that's called a cascade. So Corey went and looked at tons of, this is like by hand, looking at maps and imagery, and she essentially identified where the sites were. And by doing so, she discovered that Iran's secret nuclear facility existed, and that this is at the same time that the United States was gearing up to invade Iraq, Iran's neighbor, for allegedly having WMD. So it's a very delicate time. As a result of all of this, in 2003, the IAEA Board of Governors adopts a resolution calling for Iran to suspend all enrichment and all reprocessing related activities. It also required Iran to declare all material relevant to its enrichment program and to allow inspectors to conduct environmental sampling at any location. There's a deadline given for Iran to agree to meet these conditions, and Iran does agree to meet those by October 21st of that year. This is a deal that's struck between Iran and European foreign ministers, and basically Iran agreed to suspend its uranium enrichment activities and ratify the additional protocol, which required Iran to provide expanded declarations of its activities and granted a broader right of access by the IAEA into Iran. About 6 months later, and you'll notice this trend over the years, the IAEA rebuked Iran for not cooperating with the agency inspectors, and Iran responded by refusing to suspend enrichment related activities. 6 months later, Iran again tried to suspend enrichment related activities following talks with the E3, the UK, France, and Germany. But this was going to be only for the duration of talks, and that this was meant to lead to something more. But of course, a curveball happens. Iran begins to produce uranium hexafluoride at its Isfahan facility, and the Europeans thus walk away from negotiations. So we see this process happen again and again throughout the 2000s. You have a lot of diplomacy going back and forth, different framework agreements, trying to offer incentives for Iran to halt its enrichment program. But Iran doesn't want to give up its enrichment capability because it feels it has a sovereign right to have access to nuclear energy in that way. So it becomes something that is tied towards Iranian sovereignty, Iranian rights as a country. And at the end of the day, what happens is that in 2006, the UN Security Council adopts a resolution that imposes sanctions on Iran for its failure to suspend its enrichment-related activities. This was really bad because it escalated tensions even further. But following about 3 rounds of talks, Iran and the IAEA agreed on a work plan for Iran to answer some of these longstanding questions about nuclear activities. Later in the later 2000s, there's a new comprehensive proposal that the P5+1, so now not just the Europeans or the US, but also including Russia and China, puts forward that basically updates the incentives that they were willing to offer before. The new proposal maintains the same basic framework as the one from years before, but it highlighted an initial freeze for freeze process where Iran would halt any expansion of its nuclear activities while the UN Security Council agreed to not impose any additional sanctions. So I'm telling this story because these concepts of interim deals, freeze for freeze arrangements, all of this has come up even in the past year or two, and it seems to be a pattern of behavior where countries have tried to put a band-aid basically on the process because it's been so difficult to have a durable, comprehensive deal with Iran. Following the election of President Obama, they did an Iran policy review, and basically the United States announced it would participate fully in diplomacy with Iran alongside the others, which was a departure from the previous administration's policy that required Iran to meet UN demands first. So I bring this up also because you'll see time and time again when it comes to diplomacy with Iran, there's always a question of who is going to move first, right? Does Iran have to comply fully with its obligations before sanctions are lifted? How can this be done in a stepwise fashion? And all of this matters because neither side wants to be seen as giving in to the other. Later in the summer of 2009, Iran holds presidential elections. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is declared the winner. And this sparks tons of protests in Iran, which we probably have all seen lots of imagery from. And at that point in time, the US, the UK, and France announced that Iran has been constructing a secret second uranium enrichment facility in Fordow. Basically, after this, the process gets a bit more complicated. And at that point in time, again, the UN Security Council adopts another resolution that significantly expands sanctions on Iran. In addition to tightening proliferation-related sanctions and banning Iran from carrying out nuclear-capable ballistic missile tests, the resolution also imposes an arms embargo on the transfer of major weapon systems to Iran. Congress also adopts more sanctions, tightening US sanctions in particular on Iran's energy sector, and the EU also agrees to take further actions in terms of sanctions against Iran. After that, in 2011, Iran says that it's willing to try to do diplomacy again, but there's two preconditions: a recognition of its right to enrichment and the lifting of sanctions, which of course, this is all rejected by the P5+1. Again, Iran is ramping up its nuclear operations. It successfully achieves a sustained chain reaction in 2011 and at the Bushehr nuclear power plant. And it announces that it intends to triple the rate of 20% enriched uranium production using far more advanced centrifuge designs. So people are getting worried. At this point in time, the Russians step in more and they unveil a new proposal where Iran would take steps to increase cooperation with the IAEA and carry out confidence building measures in return for a gradual easing of sanctions. So again, now we're getting into more of a formula where there is a step for step, stepwise kind of agreement. The IAEA releases a report that basically outlines a range of activities that Iran is suspected to have engaged in based on this. And from here, there's some concerns that there were some weapons-related activities that occurred, including after 2003. Because of this, the relationship with Iran and the agency also becomes more complicated. And it takes several years, at least 2 more years before Iran meets with the P5+1 in Istanbul for talks, which they actually all call positive, to agree on a framework for continuing negotiations with a step-by-step process and reciprocal actions. The talks in Istanbul continue in Baghdad, in Moscow, in Istanbul again. And the reality is at the same time, Iran is expanding its program, but there are big differences in terms of what they're being offered. So what changes, though, is that President Rouhani is elected. And after that, the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, at the UN General Assembly in 2013, shares a very different proposal with the P5+1. And I mention this because we'll see Javad Zarif become synonymous with the JCPOA, and it just goes to show how personal diplomacy plays a huge role, because his relationship with John Kerry, who was the US Secretary of State at the time, basically defines how this moves forward. And Zarif says that Iran in the P5+1 basically will begin to think about the order of the steps that need to be implemented to address the immediate concerns of both sides, and then work towards basically an end game within the span of a year. Because of that, this is the first time that a US president makes contact with an Iranian president since 1979. President Obama calls President Rouhani, and they basically say that they think a comprehensive resolution can be reached. Talks continue in Vienna and Geneva, and basically, after some time, Zarif and the other leaders sign an agreement called the Joint Plan of Action, the JPOA. And this lays out specific steps for each side in a 6-month phase to basically create the framework for a more comprehensive solution. So the first phase pauses further developments in Iran's nuclear program, rolls back significant elements like their stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, and requires more extensive agency monitoring and access to nuclear sites. In return, Iran receives limited sanctions relief, repatriation of limited assets that had been frozen abroad. So this is Iran's money that was basically frozen abroad, and a commitment that no new nuclear-related sanctions would be imposed on Iran during the duration of the agreement. They also established a joint commission to monitor how well this is going. And this 6-month period can be extended by mutual consent of both parties. So the talks continue, and there's a hard diplomatic push to really narrow gaps. And again, personal diplomacy plays a huge role. So the Secretary of Energy at the time, Ernie Moniz, and Salehi, who is the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, were trying to find really technical solutions to tough political problems. And this is really, for me, what the JCPOA represents. So they spoke during the day. They're both nuclear physicists, by the way. They come up with ideas for how to try to solve some of the technical problems. At night, they parted ways, went over details with their negotiating teams. Secretary Moniz would then send the information back to the United States and go to bed. The national labs in the US would model various scenarios while they slept. And then the next day, Moniz would wake up in Switzerland, look at what the models said, and then go back to the negotiating table. So the JCPOA eventually exceeded that framework in 3 broad areas, including on weaponization, metallurgy, and a number of enrichment-related issues. So the main components of the JCPOA were like a cherry on the top of 2 other major agreements: Iran's bilateral agreement with the agency, which is its comprehensive safeguards agreement, which makes up for a bulk of how we know as much as we do about what's happening in Iran. The additional protocol, which is the other kind of icing on top. And then I'd say like the cherry is the JCPOA. If we are to cut back to simply implementing just Iran's comprehensive safeguard agreement, which is basically where we are today, this would mean that we would lose the measures in the JCPOA, such as caps on the quantity and levels of enrichment of uranium, continuous monitoring of the centrifuges, continuous access, the monitoring of production or acquisition of any uranium or concentrate, and we'll also lose the cap on the production of heavy water. So if we take a quick look at the additional protocol, which Iran was going to apply voluntarily under the JCPOA and did, and then they were meant to ratify it after a few years being into the JCPOA, without the additional protocol, what the agency has lost would be that the agency would no longer receive regular declarations about Iran's nuclear fuel cycle related research and development activities. It would no longer have information on the scale of operations for locations engaged in activities. They would lose information about and routine access to uranium mines and concentration plants. And also, most importantly, they would lose access to short notice access visits. So I bring all this up because this is what we've lost. The US obviously left the deal. The US had carefully negotiated the JCPOA text to ensure that there were no real legally binding obligations. It's really a series of political commitments, which is why the US called it a deal or an arrangement. But I really hate when we say that the US withdrew. There's no withdrawal clause in the JCPOA. It's a deal that was backed by a UN Security Council resolution. And if we're quick to say that Iran, as in terms of its reciprocal actions, is violating the deal, then we should also say that the US had violated the deal and violated it first, right, by reimposing sanctions, despite the fact that Iran was in full technical compliance and despite the fact that there were mechanisms within the deal to resolve disputes if the US felt like they wanted to dispute any of Iran's implementation. And when Trump was elected, of course, we knew that he wanted to do this, right? If you look at even his comments on Twitter about the JCPOA, he called it stupid. He called it the worst deal of all time. It just was a matter of time. And the Europeans really tried hard to come up with improvements to the deal to try to keep the US in. But out of nowhere, one day, President Trump announced that he was leaving. So the JCPOA became this sort of sacrificial lamb in Europe. All of a sudden, you have these debates about European strategic autonomy, self-reliance, how you can't always rely on a US that actually aligns with European values or priorities. And these debates continue today, right? So the JCPOA was a watershed moment in terms of its creation and also in terms of when the US fundamentally altered its nature by violating it and leaving it. So what happens next is that the US imposes sweeping secondary sanctions on Iran. During past international sanctions, the conditions to trade were actually easier. So in the past, Iranian buyers could transfer money to an exchange in Dubai, and then they would end up in a Danish account. But for example, now European banks are being hypersensitive about the origin of money. And of course, everybody was very scared of US secondary sanctions then hitting them. And the way that secondary US sanctions were written is kind of like a Swiss cheese. There's so many holes in it that one cannot quantify the risk of running afoul by interpretation of what the US Treasury is going to say. And therefore, you don't know what effect it could have on your business. So even humanitarian trade, which is exempt under US domestic law, international law, even that stopped. So Iran stopped being able to really engage in any international trade. Very few countries continued to engage in trade with Iran. And so the Europeans stepped in and said, look, we're going to try to make up for this economic loss as much as possible. But of course, as European economies are closely tied to American economy, it wasn't easy to really do that. So at the end of the day, what this did was that there was a trust problem that was created. Prior to Trump, the trust problem really traveled in one direction, the West not trusting that Iran was going to comply with its obligations. And therefore, the entire Iran nuclear deal was built on a foundation of protecting against Iranian non-compliance. After Trump, the Iranians said, well, any new agreement will have to at least be partially reimbalanced to fill the trust void on the other side. Beyond like politics and ideology, evidence points to the fact that any future deal with Iran, whether under Biden or any future administration, whether it's partial and just on nuclear or comprehensive on other questions, basically has to factor in the risk of non-compliance by both sides and perhaps even more primarily the West. And this changes the philosophy and consequently the content of negotiations. And this creates long-term damage because with the US cheating on the deal and the Europeans basically being unable to do anything about it, even in terms of mobilizing humanitarian trade, the West is just not as credible as it was pre-2016. And this is what Biden walked into in early 2021, now 3 years ago. He had a CNN op-ed before inauguration that was entitled, "There's a Smarter Way to Be Tough on Iran," basically outlining that his administration would try to revive the JCPOA first and put a cap on the nuclear question before dealing with other problems. There was a slow process in terms of getting staffed up. Europeans were fielding other options. The French were a little bit wary, for example, in terms of if this was really the right approach. And then before you know it, there's a change in government in Tehran, which is a more conservative administration. And them picking up from where the Rouhani administration had left off was not an option. So you needed breathing room. You have months go by, the further expansion of Iran's nuclear program, which was mandated by the Iranian parliament after the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November 2020. who's like the father of Iran's nuclear program and a top nuclear scientist. So you have Iran increasing its leverage, and you have the US basically maintaining the leverage from Trump's maximum pressure campaign. And the Iranians are saying, you're asking us to go back to 100%, but you're not willing to give the sanctions relief under the JCPOA or roll back even the additional sanctions that have been imposed by Trump. So we had a short window of time to get the deal back on track under Biden. And after some foot dragging in Washington, the change in administration in Tehran, we had a package of good texts on the table. There were three parts to these texts: a roadmap on how the US would go back into compliance, a roadmap on how Iran would go back into compliance, and then basically a sequencing document that would outline how and when this was all meant to happen. In August of 2022 is really the last time that the country sat together and that there was something on the table. And at that point in time, Iran still had some issues. One was over guarantees. How are you going to really guarantee that sanctions relief is going to work? What political guarantee, what legal guarantee, what technical guarantees can the US really make when all Biden can say is, I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z while I'm president, with former President Trump hanging in the background, already saying that he wanted to run for re-election. Then there was also the question of delisting the IRGC from sanctions or being labeled as a foreign terrorist organization, which was basically impossible for Biden to do domestically. And then there also was these other wider issues about Iran's previous behaviors, because Israel essentially stole a trove of alleged documents from Iran that pointed to the fact that Iran had not necessarily been fully transparent with its previous activities. And it raised questions of where those nuclear materials had gone. And Iran essentially wanted to wrap this into the JCPOA problem and say, let's close that file as well. But unfortunately, that's not really how things work. So just to wrap up, I'll say that, the JCPOA was never perfect, but I still don't see any good alternatives to the basic kind of quid pro quo that went along with it. Obama famously said that the alternative was war, and here we are. The Trump administration said maximum pressure would be enough, but it didn't cause Iran to cave to Secretary of State Pompeo's list of 12 and then plus one, so 13 demands. But it's safe to say that without a restored JCPOA, we could have easily, with a restored JCPOA, we could have easily had a reduced risk of massive and major confrontation with Iran. And we're now seeing that there's a major crisis unfolding in the Middle East that's parallel to the war in Ukraine. If Iran had come back and said yes to the draft that was on the table in August of 2022, I think Biden was prepared to pay the political costs of defending a return to the agreement, even though many were saying to him to wait until after the midterm elections. But Iran wasn't willing to show flexibility anymore at that point in time. And since then, formal talks have stalled. And although neither side have said the JCPOA is dead and everything has failed, efforts to de-escalate US-Iran tensions in halfway through last year, including the holding of indirect talks in Oman and the exchange of prisoners and unfreezing of Iranian oil revenue for humanitarian trade, that really raised hopes last year. But then, of course, things were overcome by events. And this unwritten de-escalation agreement with Iran, including a cap on its uranium enrichment, Iran not giving more missiles to Russia, not targeting US forces in Syria, the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war dashed hopes of progress. And I'm sorry to say now that it seems that restoring the JCPOA as we knew it is just not an option anymore. I don't like to call it dead because I think that the JCPOA will live on through the ideas and concepts that are a part of it. But that last kind of August 2022 text is basically moot. So some lessons learned is that doing diplomacy with the enemy or the other is always difficult because there is this sort of ontological anxiety against doing any deal making with somebody that you consider the enemy. And even the best verification and monitoring in the world, the most highly skilled international agency with brilliant inspectors bringing you technical facts saying Iran is abiding by the terms, At a certain point in time, that doesn't matter anymore because you simply fundamentally don't believe in doing a deal. And you fundamentally don't believe in doing a deal because half the battle is understanding the other side. And the US's biggest failure is that it simply doesn't understand Iran. And we have the struggle of understanding, therefore, between whether we can or want to influence Iran's behavior and if we're willing to offer the incentives to do so. Pressure doesn't work on its own, and persuasion doesn't work either. And the US isn't able to be consistent in terms of trying to balance those two things. Also, like I said, the Europeans discovered through this process that they sort of need to stand on their own. So you have less alignment between the US and Europeans. And also now we've had changes in terms of we can't really rely on Russia and or China in terms of being willing partners to exert their own leverage on Iran to come to the table and agree to things like the ways in which they were able to do so before. I think everyone now sees Americans more as zero sum, whereas, say, Europeans like to see themselves more as win-win. You know, Europeans are governed by coalition governments, the EU is run by committees, so compromise is really the name of the game. But the way that the US works politically is that we're constantly worried about elections, and thus you kind of revert to a zero-sum approach to try to look tough often. And countries don't like to negotiate when they're perceived as being in a position of weakness. And we've seen this from Iran. So I guess the question now becomes, are we comfortable with non-zero sum approaches with Iran? And if we are comfortable with those kinds of approaches, can we sustain them? Can we deliver on them? And so far, the only two things that have worked with Iran in terms of rolling back its nuclear program, giving more transparency, have actually been non-zero sum, the JCPOA, and then the de-escalation arrangement last year. And naturally, both of them we have self-sabotaged one way or another. So lastly, I'll just say that there's a difference between strategy and tactics. And when it comes to Iran, I think the last time that the US really had a strategy that matched tactics was under Obama. It was part of a wider normalization of relations, the creation of not just a band-aid, but a real foundation for new relations. And there was international consensus building for that effort across the board. And that period of 2010 to 2015, from 2015, is very unique. And we've never seen that again. And we've not really seen that ever before. And what followed under the Trump administration wasn't really a strategy. They didn't really have a vision. They just had an anti-JCPOA strategy. And then under President Biden, we've had a de-escalatory approach, but again, not really a strategy. It was more de-escalate, put a cap on things, put this on the back burner while we deal with Russia and China. So I say this all to say that, we really need to come up with a new strategy on Iran. And it's very tough to do. I don't know what's going to happen this year. I'm hoping that we'll get to a point where we are back to that kind of de-escalation understanding, even if it means having different red lines and different understandings than last year based on what's happened. But it'll really depend on the US presidential election. And from there, we can have very, very different scenarios happen. So I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Sahil. That was really interesting. I think it was also like quite a bit of a deep dive. I personally have plenty of questions swirling around in my head. I think we can get started with this discussion now. If anyone has any comments, any questions, any contributions that they might have, feel free to just raise your hand or pop them in the chat and I can read them out for you if you don't feel comfortable contributing like that.
Hey, Sahil, thank you so much. That was a very insightful introduction. I just learned a lot of things. Thank you so much. We'll continue with the question after the session. Yeah.
I might just kick this off with, I guess, a question that's a little bit more pertinent to the current context. I think, especially in terms of mainstream media, there's a lot of sensationalization, misinformation about Iran's role, Iran's nukes, this kind of narrative. And in the context of what's happening in Israel and Palestine at the moment, and some of the kind of rising escalation we saw there for a moment, and then Iran's demonstration of restraint, the diplomatic efforts that went into trying to scale that all back. Do you think that the current context, what's happening, will reshape or kind of like have a particular kind of significant impact on specifically the Iranian nuclear issue, or reshaping some of those dynamics? Or do you think that actually maybe the two can still be held quite separately?
I think it's happening right now as we speak, right? There is an ongoing nuclear policy debate in Iran that's emerged again, as a result of what's happening in the region, because essentially Iran needs to figure out how to deal with a long-standing zero-sum approach by the US and others towards its nuclear program. And again, the JCPOA and the de-escalation agreement of last year really succeeded at trying to put a cap on things, rolling back things, but they didn't last. And the US, of course, didn't last in the most recent iteration of this because of what happened in terms of Hamas's attack in Israel. And we know that Iran also has been certified by the US intelligence community as not having materially supported those attacks. So Iran basically sees all of this as quite linked together because it's damned if they do, damned if they don't, essentially, right? It can try to restrain its behavior in the region in order to make a nuclear deal with the US to get economic relief. But if something happens, they feel they'll be blamed inherently, and then we're back to square one. So I think that Iran will continue to increase its leverage by increasing its capacity on the nuclear side. It has no reason not to. Sanctions are basically dialed up to like 8 on the 1 out of 10 dial. Or what? Sorry, yeah, 1 out of 10 dial. If the US dials it to 9 or 10, what is that really going to do at this point? Iran has now built adaptation and resiliency to try to deal with the sanctions the best way they can. But they are not willing to roll back anything, I think, at this moment, especially because we don't know what's going to happen when it comes to the US presidential elections.
Thanks so much. We have a question in the chat from Larissa. She has said, I can't help but think about the double standards employed by the US and Europe when it comes to monitoring Iran's nuclear activities and then it turning a blind eye to Israel's activities. What do you see as the way to prevent these double standards rooted in politics? Would that potentially be a deal with Israel as well? I can't see Iran being okay with doing anything so long as Israel gets some kind of a free pass, particularly in relation to its nuclear activities and its known possession of nuclear weapons. I think that's really interesting, I think, in the context of some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of like the ontological anxiety and the othering, and also just the global nuclear order and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it just underscores how scary the situation is, especially in the region at the moment. The region is not free of nuclear weapons, and we know that. And you have the potential for this war to spiral into a much more broader regional conflict. And we have already seen elsewhere in the world at the moment that there's anxieties of what leaders suddenly become willing to do, or what levers of power they're willing to exert while feeling under duress and feeling backed into a corner. So it's hard. How do you prevent double standards rooted in politics? It's very difficult. I think we're seeing a transition in the US right now, a slow one, in terms of wanting to try to hold Israel more accountable for its actions, trying to hold it more accountable for towards international law, etc. I just have a feeling that we're not going to be seeing Israel admit suddenly to having nuclear weapons officially. We've seen as an Israeli official, I think, for the first time, sometime a few months ago, sort of flex a nuclear muscle. But I just don't see this kind of happening. I think Israel's official policy of kind of like strategic ambiguity will continue. And therefore, there's not going to really be something that can be achieved in terms of dealing with Israel's nuclear weapons. And also two very different things, right? Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So it's not like we're trying to come up with an arms control agreement between Iran and Israel to try to get them to reduce their nuclear arsenals. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. And the most recent US compliance report that just came out stated that yet again, that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So yeah, difficult to say. It's kind of like comparing apples and oranges, but it is very interesting how there have been so many headlines, even in the past few weeks, about Iran's nuclear arsenal. which, just goes to show how far we are from reality. And I used to be asked all the time, including by senior officials around the world, about Iran's nuclear arsenal. And I would have to ask, you're talking about Iran's like stockpile of nuclear materials that they've not weaponized, or what are we talking about here? So it's very, very interesting. And there's a lot of these discursive differences that I think that the media, public discourse, etc., amplifies, and it causes really deep misunderstandings of realities in the world. And how do you break away from that, right? And we see it in the conflict. We see it in terms of people's understanding of Iran's nuclear program. We see it across the board on so many different issues. And that's why it's important that everybody who's on this call works to help clarify those kinds of things to public audiences through your writing, through your communities, through your families, through your friends. It's so important to translate the work that we do to those kinds of audiences so that the world becomes better informed on these topics.
Thank you so much. I think that last point is also something I think about a lot in terms of like our informal, like ethical obligation when you occupy this space, especially within the civil society kind of segment of this like field. I have one direct message, and it's a question, and I think it's kind of simple and straight to the point. It says, in your opinion, do you think it's fair, the characterization of Iran's kind of nuclear diplomacy as restrained over the last few years?
Over the last few years, I would say that Iran offered the most restraint in the first year after President Trump exited, violated, withdrew, whatever you want to call it, the deal, because it really made no operational changes per se. And it also, everything that it did start to do was technically reversible and was being fully monitored. It was after that year then that they started to ratchet up by taking steps that were becoming more and more provocative, but again, technically reversible. And the way that they did it was that they did it, every few months, and it was proactively announced and timed. And they gave those few months in between the moves to offer basically a window for diplomacy. Of course, nobody was really able to give Iran what it wanted because US secondary sanctions were so strong. But that was kind of their approach then. And then again, after the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the parliament, which is a more hardline parliament at that point in time, basically mandates the government to take even further steps at cutting transparency and ratcheting up the nuclear program. So I would say it was restrained in a lot of ways, and then became less restrained and restrained over time. But a lot of people in Iran think that maybe they should have never done that, that maybe they should have said, well, okay, you're fully leaving your obligations. Well, then we're going to fully leave our obligations. Because what happened is that Iran, over time, as it took its steps away from full implementation, the headlines would be Iran violates deal. Iran does XYZ, Iran increases enrichment, violating the deal. And of course, it'd be not mentioned that they were doing it as a reciprocal action towards the US violating its obligations, right? So you, again, have created this discursive difference, just like what we just spoke about. The US withdrew and Iran violated. And this is a very difficult narrative to come away from, right? So
that's really interesting. Thank you. I have, maybe in the meantime, in case anyone else is just kind of like coming up with any questions or thoughts. Actually, wait, I'll let Declan pop in, and then I have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Thanks, Anahita. And yeah, thanks for this really, really interesting talk, Sahil. The Iran and US kind of nuclear relations, the first thing I kind of looked at in the nuclear field was kind of my gateway in. So it's been strange not to it's just been strange to see how it's developed. But I guess my question was centered around, because I was more familiar with kind of the post JCPOA and the build up to it than I have been to what's happened since, I guess. And I was wondering if, because I see often, particularly when talking about, say, the Trump regime and Donald Trump's behavior in office and his potential behavior if he gets back in, about being something really kind of unpredictable or quite different. And I was wondering how similar actually that you felt his behavior has been, his administration's approach to Iran was to, say, Bush Juniors and the John Bolton kind of led regime and their kind of approach to Iran. As you know, from my understanding, they took when you're speaking of zero sums game, I found that very interesting because they took a very, I guess, aggressive coercion approach to Iran. It was very, very much about aggressive coercion rather than real diplomacy or deal making. That I would say, and yeah, I guess, is there, I guess, what are the similarities and differences, and is kind of Trump's behavior kind of more rooted still in a recognizable American politics than maybe how it's sometimes phrased as something totally different and new and unique?
Yeah, I mean, I think that over time, the hawks on Iran have become more adept and more nuanced in terms of how they deploy those more pressure tactics. We saw it in terms of how they built a really strong sanctions wall against Iran, including after it became clear that President Trump was not going to be reelected. And this was simply just to make it more difficult for President Biden to roll back those sanctions. So I think that over time, they've just deepened their understanding of how to target Iranian behavior, how to try to exert pressure on Iran. But of course, all this has done is bring Iran closer to the verge of being, for nuclear weapons or being capable of getting them. It's only made Iran more aggressive in the region, more repressive at home. So in terms of like Secretary of State Pompeo's list of 12 demands, which is like really a strong reference point for what the Trump administration wanted Iran to do for there to be any kind of change in the US's approach at that time. It's just a crazy read. So if I read, I would just read the 12 points. It was crazy then and it's crazy now, because these are very lofty demands, and really it points to the fact that they don't necessarily want to change Iran's behavior. They want to fundamentally change Iran itself. And then you get into the topic of regime change, right? Fundamentally altering Iran's governance, its political structure, all of those kinds of things. And if President Trump comes back, I'm sure he'll be surrounded by people who start to err more on that side. So not looking to see how you can change Iran's behavior, and then coming up with the incentive structures to do that and managing Iran as it is and as it will likely continue to exist, but erring more on the side of how do we fundamentally change Iran? How do we push it so far down a hole that the place collapses, the economy collapses, that the government collapses? So yeah, let's see what happens. But I think that certain trends continue, but the tactics look very different in this day and age.
Thank you so much. I have two kind of like two parts questions. I think maybe I'll ask the first one. I'm really curious about this thing you said about personal diplomacy and personal stakeholder relationships. It's something I look at a bit, and I'm really curious to see just how influential that kind of scope of diplomacy, that practice of informal diplomacy, even in relationship building, has for these kinds of situations. Is there anyone in your mind, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, that you could see potentially like in their political capacity playing this kind of like personal role to be like synonymous with progress, synonymous with developments? Or do you think we're kind of past that stage where we don't really have people like that anymore, either on the Iranian side or the US side or within Europe, who could maybe spearhead something and revitalize some of this progress?
It's so hard because basically the political costs of wanting to do diplomacy with Iran have become higher and higher, right? So are people going to be willing to put their personal necks on the line to be associated with doing diplomacy with Iran if doing diplomacy with Iran equates to looking soft on Iran? Answer is probably not. And we're seeing that not just in the US, but amongst Democrats and Republicans, but also in Europe. And for Europe, and especially the EU, the JCPOA was like the biggest foreign policy accomplishment because it coordinated the talks, it coordinated the implementation. And I'm really lucky to have been able to work for several years with Federica Mogherini, Cathy Ashton, all these powerhouse leaders, many of them women, who became synonymous with this huge diplomatic push, that especially that 2010 to 2015 window, like I said, that led to the deal. I don't really see who would be willing to step up in that way anymore. I think everybody feels badly burned. Iran feels badly burned. The US feels burned in terms of they feel like they put all this effort in to try to revive the deal. And then at the end, Iran basically said, no go. But yeah, it's hard to say. Hopefully, the dynamics will improve in a way that in a second Biden administration, should he be elected, that there's less of a need to pander and that there's less of a need to worry about reelection. And that if he makes it a priority and if he builds the international consensus behind that priority, just as President Obama did, and that the allies fall in line, that others, regional allies, partners, they fall in line, that something could happen, right? It's never off the table. There's been reports even in recent weeks that the Biden administration is looking at what can be done diplomatically. But in terms of identifying who is going to be willing to actually take a stand for diplomacy and protecting diplomacy, I don't really see many people in the West, and I don't really see many people in Iran. But in Iran, obviously, you have a supreme leader, right? And the supreme leader doesn't want his legacy to be defined by committing the same mistake twice. And they can't base their second attempt at this on like an inshallah policy, right? Like they have to, it has to be very clear that this is going to work because they don't want to look fooled twice. And of course, if he says that we're going to do something, then the system will fall in line behind him or whoever his successor may be. You don't have the same political structures in the other countries to sustain it in that same way. There isn't an authoritarian leader that everybody sort of will follow. So maybe it's just a symptom of our systems, and maybe this is just how it is always going to be. And how do you then sustain, like I said, a non-zero sum approach when there isn't an appreciation for that across the board in the US or in Europe?
Thank you again. This is, I think, this conversation could keep going for quite some time. I'm curious because I think the conversation has touched quite a bit on US domestic policy and the fact that it's a little bit uncertain whether we're going to get a Trump administration, whether Biden will be reelected, and what implication that has for progress with Iran. But I'm quite curious from the Iranian side. I guess coming off the back of, a couple, like just over a year and a bit longer since Zanzandagi Azadi, the Women Life Freedom Movement, and the protests and the internal unrest in Iran. Do you think that that moment in time, I know that for some, there was really sincere belief that that would bring some kind of change or shift in terms of Iran's domestic situation. And for others with a bit more maybe cynicism or realism, depending on where you sit, they really didn't think that it would shake things up very much. But do you think that at that point, or with some of these key moments in Iran's own domestic policies and own domestic kind of situation and possibly even unrest, that has some kind of new pathway for Iran's like nuclear diplomacy and its relationship with the US, or maybe that the US in that moment saw that there might be a feasible time to kind of like rethink its approach, or that it might even influence its consideration of its strategy towards Iran in any way?
I don't think so. I feel like the system can't make concessions that would be satisfactory. At best, they can make lax enforcement of hijab, or they can do other small kind of band-aid things, but that's not going to be enough for the people of Iran. And larger reform or change isn't really on the cards. And it doesn't seem like there's a thriving civil society effort that can be sustained either to push back. And of course, what could have helped with that would have been not squashing the entire Iranian middle class through US secondary sanctions and further limiting their ability to really do much and having much agency in general. So it's hard to say. I mean, I don't see the protest movements in Iran or domestic unrest resulting in any larger reform or change. And unfortunately, we also have a continuation of sanctions, which just further represses the civil society and the people of Iran. That's who the sanctions are ultimately affecting the most. So yeah, it's a very sad situation, because I think had we been able to restore the JCPOA more quickly under the Biden administration and get um, the Iranian economy more stabilized, even if, say, a Trump would be returning, in a 2.0 fashion, those few years of economic relief could have substantially helped build up the middle class again in a way, and also industry in particular, in a way that would have helped, civil society. But yeah.
No further questions. Oh, I've just seen a raised hand. Farouk, if you'd like to come in. Perfect.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Okay, I have a question. For instance, what is Iran's end game related to their nuclear program? I mean, what they're trying to achieve, or if they're like trying to build a nuclear weapon, how long it will take them to build a nuclear weapon, in your opinion?
So what was so I think it was like, what's the end game, and then if they wanted to have a nuclear weapon, how long it would take? Is that the question? Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. In terms of an end game, I think it's to continue to build leverage, right? I mean, I think that they've said that doctrinally that they haven't changed their posture, that they don't want nuclear weapons. But I think right now the end game is to basically see how much leverage they can build up. And quite frankly, in the most recent texts that were on the table, their leverage helped them be able to do things that they weren't able to get the other countries to agree to when we had the JCPOA. There were like certain changes made to the text. For example, keeping the advanced centrifuges in storage in Iran. There were a lot of things that, in terms of Iran's capacity that they built up, that they built it up so that they have it as a tool, not just to in negotiations, but also to keep the other parties accountable if there is a diplomatic solution again, right? So by having that leverage built up, they can retain some of that, some of those capacities. So, for example, like I said, under the August 2022 text, Iran would keep the advanced centrifuges under lock and seal inside Iran. So they wouldn't have to give them up. So then, say if the US left a deal again, they would be able to quickly ratchet up their capacity in a way that wouldn't require them to like build those centrifuges again. So I think right now that's the policy, right? They're increasing their leverage. And when it comes to determining a timeline for how long it would take for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, you always hear about breakout capacity. Breakout capacity is related to them having enough significant quantity of nuclear material for a nuclear weapon. It doesn't take into account the amount of time it would take to weaponize that material, to test that weapon, to make sure that it works, and for it to be really like a deployable type of weapon, right? And breakout can either be in secret or it can be fast, but it can't be both. So breakout is really, okay, if you're using all the material, equipment, facilities, and people that you have available to rush to that fastest point of having one nuclear bomb's worth of nuclear material, that's what like breakout is. And I think right now people are saying that breakout is less than a week. But we know that that doesn't include the time it would take to produce an actual nuclear weapon. So I just want people to be super clear about that. That breakout is not about the time it takes to build a nuclear weapon. It's the time it takes to have enough material for one. And the idea would be that you would take everything you have and rush towards a bomb's worth of material. And in this case, it would be enriched uranium. And if you're going to do that, then you have to really use all the facilities, people, material that you have. So you can't really do it in secret. We would know very quickly that Iran was doing this. And if they were able to, or they would try to replicate and reproduce and duplicate all these capabilities and this material in secret, they could certainly make that attempt, but it would be very, very difficult to do so, given how many eyes and ears are on Iran. So it's very complicated. There's not really a metric to be able to say how long until Iran would be able to get a nuclear weapon, because if we knew that they were rushing towards doing something like that, I could guarantee that there would be various different parties doing various different things to try to stall those attempts, or perhaps offer incentives to get Iran to stop those attempts.
And Desiree, if you'd like to come in.
Hi, yes. So I kind of wanted to go back on the topic of the recent protests that Iran has had. I think a lot of Iranians believe that US intervention, which unfortunately includes sanctions, will assist in regime change. Many also believe that the JCPOA was going to limit any possible regime change. That's why a lot of, Iranian Americans were right-leaning at that time. So do you think this current strategy or tactic, or I guess lack of thereof, will actually interfere with proper regime change?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that so far we've seen that the US's understanding of what sanctions are meant to achieve and what they actually do are two very different things. I think that the US, again, has tried to use this as a tool in the toolbox to reshape Iran or Iran's behavior, whether it's its nuclear program, its regional influence and posturing, or more, including domestic policies, like how it relates to civil society. But sanctions have not achieved any of those goals. And I worry that because it's become such a knee-jerk tool to try to showcase that we're being tough on Iran and all the sins that we know that Iran is committing at home and abroad, that people just revert to it as a tool. And the things is that we have a really good sanctions imposing and enforcing bureaucracy in the US, but we don't have a good sanctions relief bureaucracy in the US. So you're imposing these sanctions with the notion that these sanctions could be lifted if you change your behavior or if you do things differently. But the US is not credible in that offer anymore, or is less credible than they were, since the Obama years. So sanctions aren't interpreted the same way either, say by Iran. So if you feel like you changing your behavior is not going to actually lead to meaningful sanctions relief, why would you change your behavior? So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question really. It's more a philosophical answer, but yeah.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you. Just wanted to pick your brain at that. I do have another question kind of on the complete opposite of the spectrum. So recently, Russia and Iran relations have strengthened in some way. Not a lot of people have been focusing on that. So I kind of wanted to know your take on whether or not, if that partnership were to strengthen, what would the US do? What would their strategy or tactic be in that situation?
I think that the US is going to have a very difficult time trying to influence Iran and Russia's relationship, because the area in which the US and Russia were working together was to come to a negotiated solution with Iran on its nuclear program. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia basically has taken a back seat and said, yeah, we're not going to really help you with that effort in the same ways that we were willing to do so before. In fact, they, during the talks of 2022 on restoring the JCPOA, after the February invasion, Foreign Minister Lavrov even said, well, we're going to need to look into seeing whether or not, US sanctions are going to affect Russia's ability to implement the JCPOA as well, et cetera, et cetera. So now we've even just deepened the divisions since then. So I think Russia used to be more of a hesitant partner in terms of its partnership with Iran, but Ukraine really changed that. And I just don't see how the US would be able to positively influence that at all, because the US isn't working with Russia anymore on the Iran nuclear question.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions? Just gonna wait a moment.
One last, maybe it's not relevant, but yeah. Okay. Do you think like the recent attacks that Iran had on Israel, and they just said like the equation have now been changed in the Middle East? Do you think the equation has been changed, or it is the same as the status quo? Like Israelis have been attacking the Iranian assets in Syria or Iraq, maybe, or does this change in the future? What do you think? Like,
So basically, whether or not recent events have sort of changed the dynamics. I mean, yes, I think they've substantially changed the dynamics because we had a de-escalation approach at the end of last year in the fall. And then now we're basically in a bit of a limbo. The understanding that the West and Iran had before in terms of red lines and all of that has changed. And this is all based on what's happening in the region, right? So it's difficult to divorce, because the de-escalation arrangement of last year was a nuclear and regionally mixed arrangement, right? Iran would sort of pause a few things on the nuclear side, pause a few regional things in exchange for the US unfreezing this $7 billion in Iranian assets that were in South Korea, and then that could be used. So it was an economic quid pro quo, not on just nuclear, but also regional, so that everything has become tied together a bit. And therefore, what the US saw in terms of the October attack on Israel was used as a justification for reneging on that commitment to allow Iran to access those frozen assets for humanitarian trade. So everything has become sort of linked. So it's impossible now, I think, to get away from that. And also it raises the expectations, right? Because the Biden administration always wanted eventually to have a longer, stronger, broader agreement with Iran that would cover some of those more regional pieces. And now that they have made steps towards that, towards more like comprehensive actions or agreements, it makes it more difficult because everything becomes more entangled. It was much more successful when we had the JCPOA, which was a very narrowly focused scope of what we were trying to do. And then we could really hammer down and deepen how we were going to achieve that, So everything becoming tied together informally or say formally in any future agreement is just going to make it all the more complex. So I'm hoping things don't go in that direction.
Amazing.
thank
Any
you so much.
more questions? Then in that case, I think we can end the session there. Thank you so much, Sahil, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on this session called Nuclear Diplomacy with Iran, Then and Now. I hope for all of you, this has been a really interesting and thought-provoking session. I know I found that immensely interesting. Thank you to those of you who made the time to join us live today and for all of your questions. That was a really interesting discussion. And thank you to any of you who may be joining in later, joining us virtually and watching the recording. Have a great day, morning, evening, wherever you are. Thanks so much.